What do Roman executioners and Hamas butchers have in common? Today we're going to connect something that happened on the Via Dolorosa 2,000 years ago to something that happened in Los Angeles a couple of days ago to something that happened on the hills of southern Lebanon 42 years ago. This is DaviD TaL. This is the Balagan connection. Stay with me to the end and you'll see how all of these things tie together. But first of all, before we go too far, I want to kind of put something important here on the table in front of us. If you can see, I'm not shaved today, which is kind of rare. Not shaving for a time is a sign of mourning in Jewish culture. Specifically, I'm mourning my father-in-law. A lot of you have known Pastor Jeff Johnson, who was the pastor of Calvary Chapel Downey for many years, a close friend of mine for many years, a beacon in my journey, my spiritual journey to return to God after many years, and for the last couple of months, my father-in-law. And I just want to say, Yeh Zichro Baruch, Pastor Jeff Johnson, we're going to miss you. But back to what we're talking about. The Balagan Connection wants to talk about something that happened a really, really long time ago. And again, those of you who have read the account or seen The Passion, for instance, okay, I want to make a special connection to the final hours in the life of Jesus. And in order to do that, I want to open up a passage from Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27 talks about the stages or the events leading up to the crucifixion, and specifically an event that those of you who have been with me on tour, we've talked about in a site on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem called the Ecce Homo, or the Lithostratus, or the Sisters of Zion site, where we go downstairs and we find a Roman pavement that connects to what we're talking about here. And it says this: "And the soldiers of the governor took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered a whole garrison around him, and they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him. And when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him, mocking him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' They mocked him, and they spat on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him and made fun of him, they took the robe off of him and put his clothes back on and led him away to be crucified." I've led tours to the site hundreds of times. We've sat on that pavement and opened up the version of what we call the King's Game. The King's Game is like a game etched into the stone on the pavement that has different symbols that we know from different sources that Roman soldiers would play with people who are going to be crucified. They would actually throw a dice. One of the tortures would come up and they would inflict this torture on the victim, and they like to have fun with the victim before he's going to be crucified. Like, okay, we're going to crucify him, he's going to die, but let's have fun. Let's enjoy this as much as possible. And I remember for years I've been sitting there and explaining what crucifixion is, how it takes place, and the glee and the fun of the Roman soldiers. I've been explaining this to Christians for years now, and it always gave me a feeling that the excitement and the enthusiasm of the Roman soldiers was what made the actual execution that we all know had to happen, and we all know was part of the plan, but made that even more horrific. A couple of days ago, I was invited to a screening of the raw footage of the 7th of October attack that took place in Israel. It's 47 minutes long, and what they did is they took the footage off the GoPros, off the cell phones, and off the cameras that were actually security cameras that were spread around. This is footage that the perpetrators themselves actually collected, that they kind of collected like people do on their cameras as memories that they want to keep. And the Israeli government put together 47 minutes of this raw footage of what happened there, and they took a theater in Los Angeles, and me and about 45, 50 other people sat there and watched this. I'm not going to go into the details. You don't want the details. I mean, some of you have seen it. And again, I've seen even worse. They kind of toned it down. But even the toned down version was horrific. But what struck me more than anything is the glee, the enthusiasm, the excitement, the pride that the perpetrators were taking in doing such an evil deed. And I couldn't help but being reminded of the Roman soldiers who needed to do what needed to be done, because that is part of the plan. But what made it harsher and harder for me on a personal level is the fun that they took in, and the Bible says, in mocking him and putting a reed in his hand and playing with him. And I saw the people on October 7th doing the same thing with the people that they were actually doing these evil deeds to. And as terrible as the deed is, the glee, the fun, the excitement was very biblical and very scary. And it was very scary because it kind of came up in direct contrast with something that I have experienced personally. Most of you know, those of you who have been on the tour with me, those of you have not, okay? I am a major in the IDF. I'm a combat soldier. I've seen combat in different places. And when I was 19 years old, the Israeli army went into southern Lebanon, and I actually saw action in southern Lebanon fighting against the Syrians. Some of you have heard my accounts of the first Syrian tank I took out in that war. And if any of you remember that, or I'm going to kind of put a couple of points here, what was important to me, and I've been doing this to groups of tourists, of Christian tourists who've come to understand Israel deeply, was that I took pride in my first kill, the first Syrian tank that I took out. But it was about 2 days later that I realized how horrific that was. And I am very ashamed to say that my first kill made me feel good. I am ashamed to say that even though I took pride in the first kill, it took me a while to realize how terrible that was. And a lot of guilty conscience was directly connected to my event on the hills of southern Lebanon in 1982. And I realized deeply and profoundly that there's no glory, there's no joy, even when you do need to go into combat and do what you need to do. There's no glory, it made a scratch on my soul. And what I'm trying to say is that the Roman soldiers that crucified Jesus, these terrible terrorists that perpetrated this event, were in a different place from where I was. And what scared me on that screening of those 47 minutes of footage from what happened, more than the gruesomeness and more than the bloodiness, and again, things that you can't even talk about, was the excitement that they took. What I'm trying to say is something deep, profound, had broken in these people on the 7th of October. Something as deep and profound that had broken in the Roman soldiers 2,000 years ago. God uses bad people for his plan. But I am totally sure that being used by God to perpetrate something that is so horrific, you have to pay a price. And what I'm trying to say here is that is the difference between us and our enemies. We do what we need to do. And again, what's going on in Gaza is hard and horrific. But we don't take pride. We don't take joy. We don't get excited about killing the enemy. The opposite is true. It breaks our heart. And anybody who says that Israel is perpetrating genocide doesn't know what it means to be a combat soldier. Anybody who says that Israel is targeting innocent civilians doesn't know what it means to be a combat soldier. I've been there. I know what it means. We do not want to. But I will say this very clearly. We will get our hostages out. They will come home. So we've connected 2,000 years ago, a couple of days ago, and 42 years ago. And we've connected the fact that taking pride and glee in doing evil things means that there's a very deep break in whoever is perpetrating this. And this is something I wanted to connect you to. This is DaviD TaL. This is a Balagan Connection. Hope to see you here soon.